Hello, I'm Riz Khan. The rise of the far right in European politics has been a feature of this extraordinary year of elections. And the past week has seen two European powerhouse nations, Britain and France, subjecting their future to the destiny of democracy. At their closest point, a mere 22 miles of water is all that separates these two neighbours, uneasy allies whose rivalry extends far beyond the European football field. Well, that stretch of water, known to the French as La Manche and to the British as the English Channel, has long been a bastion against the invasion of the United Kingdom. But it has, in recent years, become a focal point for one of the key issues which has rallied the right across Europe: immigration. Well, immigration was at the heart of Britain's narrow decision to leave the European Union. It was hailed as an opportunity to regain control of Britain's borders and put an end to the constant flotilla of refugees crossing the sea from France to the UK. The Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's pledge to stop the boats and his inability to do so was a factor in his party's historic defeat in last week's election. The Conservative solution was to send illegal immigrants to Rwanda as an attempt to discourage refugees from making the perilous crossing. But then came the election, which saw the Labour Party swept into power with a landslide majority. And the first act of the incoming Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, was to pronounce the Rwanda scheme as dead and buried. But the issue of immigration can't be buried, and the new government's policy will require cooperation with France and the European Union to break up the people trafficking gangs that enable and encourage the crossings. Meanwhile, immigration and the economic cost of living were prominent pillars of the discontent that bolstered far-right parties in the recent European elections. French President Emmanuel Macron's domestic response to their success was to call a snap election, taking the nation and even his own centrist party by surprise. Political analysts scratched their heads and struggled to suggest explanations. Was Macron trying to catch Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party off guard and unready to fight elections? Was he trying to unite the nation against the far right? Or perhaps the answer was a more extraordinary scheme: to put them in power where their populist policies would fail and ultimately be rejected by the French people once and for all. Whatever the motive, the first round results sent tremors through the political landscape in France and across Europe as Le Pen's party won most of the seats and the biggest share of the vote. Suddenly, the prospect of a far-right French government for the first time since the Second World War seemed not only possible but even probable. The reaction was desperate but ultimately effective as the parties of the left and centre collaborated in an unholy alliance to sacrifice their own interests and keep out the right at all costs. In the second round of voting, political rivals stepped aside to avoid splitting the anti-populist vote, and it worked. The leftist alliance, the New Popular Front, emerged with the most seats, followed by Macron's centrist Ensemble coalition, with the Le Pen National Party reduced to third place. But it produced some essential questions. With no party winning an overall majority, who will govern France? Is the nation facing a future of collaboration and compromise, or years of infighting and political horse trading? Did the whole episode leave President Macron damaged and diminished, or did he, in effect, save his nation from the far right? Marine Le Pen's ambitions have been thwarted for now, but does the huge increase in populist party support mean its grip on power is inevitable and simply postponed? Or will left-leaning governments in both the UK and France lead to a new Anglo-French entente cordiale, uniting these ancient rivals against the rising tide of right-wing fervour in Europe? Later in this episode, we'll consider the challenges facing Britain's new Labour government as they aim to fix what some see as broken Britain. But first, let's seek some answers to the many questions facing France after the elections. I'm joined now by Senator Nathalie Goulet of the centrist Union of Democrats and Independents. It's certainly been an anxious couple of weeks for the French people, Senator. What is the mood in the country right now following the elections?
Well, I think that the people are more or less speechless because we have the country which is really on the right side of the politic, and then we elect a chamber on the left. So there is something which is difficult to read for people, and now we will need some time to swallow.
So at a first glance, who do you see as the biggest winners and losers?
Well, I think that the party of the President of the Republic, for sure, is the loser. First, he lost a lot of seats, but then he jeopardized completely the political landscape by this dissolution and recall election, which was absolutely unexpected, unnecessary, and dangerous. And here we are.
Now, there's a lot of debate about President Macron's motives in calling these snap elections that shocked the nation, including his own party, actually. So talk me through the various theories for why this happened. What's your own view as well?
We have no explanation. I think that he wanted the country to express itself, which has been done yesterday. It's not understandable. I mean, the situation. He lost the majority in 2022. So the situation now is worse than it was 3 weeks ago. But nobody can explain exactly what he was looking for.
Well, a couple of the theories. One is that he wanted to catch the national rally by surprise because they had to get around 1,000 candidates together so quickly. And the other theory is possibly that he wanted them to win so they could show that they were not suited to being in power.
Yeah, we have all this explanation, and at the end of the day, there are all this mercato and all the candidates withdrawing themselves to prevent the national rally to win more seats. And at the end of the day, you have the national rally who has 3 million ballots more than the other party and has less seats. So that will probably create a big commotion in the people among the people in the street, because they will not understand why this system is so unfair to them, because you have more ballot and less seats. And at the end of the day, we have this left-wing coalition, which is like the wading between a rabbit and a fish. And we will see what he will give as bracket. I think nothing good.
Senator, the first round of elections resulted in Marine Le Pen's populist National Rally emerging as the biggest party and presenting the prospect of a far-right government in France. Now, that sent shockwaves throughout not only France, but also across Europe. What was your reaction to that first poll?
Well, that was expected that was expected. When you are in the countryside like myself, like you meet the people every week, you know that they are very unhappy with politicians. They don't trust them. And then we have a lot of trouble which has not been resolved for the last decades, like immigration, like security, all those kind of topics who are the basis of the topic of the extreme right wing. And it's exactly the same in other countries.
As we touched on, the widespread alarm forced the centre and left blocs into an uncomfortable alliance to keep out that national rally. How did that work, in your opinion?
I think we have to wait, because we don't know. According to the numbers, it will be difficult to create a majority. And then now start a big mercato in Assemblée Nationale to know who will be the speaker and how this coalition will deal with the successful election of yesterday. Are they going to create a big coalition? Are they going to have a socialist party, Green party, extreme left party? Because, you know, every time you create a party, you have a president, you have a car, you have more time to speak in the session. So everything now is connecting with the number of members that each party will have. And we don't know if they will keep the coalition as it is, or it will divide it into different parties, because the people say we don't want extreme left to be with us. But at the same time, it's the program they give to the elector means that the day after the elections, they will start to cheat, because they will divide it themselves. So right now, we don't know exactly how it will be, because we need to know how they will get organized in the current days.
It's interesting, yes, as you put it into context, the right and centre are far from being comfortable partners, yet they've asked their own candidates to step aside, their own supporters to put aside their own inclinations and vote for a political rival, purely to avoid splitting the anti-right vote. Now, so the results are as much of a negative vote for the least repugnant opponent rather than being a positive vote for the preferred candidate. Is that really how democracy is supposed to work?
Well, I don't agree completely. I think we had a lot of vote in favor of the National Rally. That was a lot. And as I told you previously, the number of ballots for the National Rally was way, way above all of the 3 million ballots more than any other party. So, and then this strategy of Republican front against the National Rally works well because they lost their planned majority for something else, which is now 140. I don't know exactly how many seats, but now they are downgraded to the third place, which was not the case if we are looking to the ballots. So there is something that the people will not understand in the street, believe me.
Well, yes, Emmanuel Macron's party ultimately lost seats and presented power to the Left Alliance, which includes communists. But the result did keep Marine Le Pen's right-wing National Rally out of power, as you say, despite the votes. So did President Macron miscalculate, or did he actually pull off one of the greatest political masterstrokes in French history?
Joker. No, I think it's a big mistake. I think it's a big mistake, and I was thinking about this big mistake from the very beginning. 3 reasons. The first one is that we were keeping saying that European elections are on a European level and that has nothing to do with the national situation. And the evening of the result of European election, it dissolved Assemblée Nationale. So already there is a misunderstanding. We were keeping saying that European elections have nothing to do with the France election and blah, 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 and the French situation. And then at 8 o'clock, the day of the result of European election, we dissolved Assemblée Nationale. Why? We don't understand. Then it's a miscalculation because that create a big commotion in the political landscape. For nothing, he has no majority now. And then it jeopardizes, as I told you, all the landscape on the eve of the Olympic Games. We will not have any government. We have a security issue. We have political issue. And then we spread a lot of mistrust in the population because the population who vote for the National Rally, they didn't have the seat in accordance to their vote. I don't see a light in the darkness. I don't see any good point on this situation. And for us, as a member of the parliament, as politician, it's not readable. We have no explanation to give to the people.
So to expand on what you're saying there, Senator, with no single dominant party in the French parliament, how likely are we to see more moderate politics with the centrists acting as kingmakers? Or could this possibly lead to years of bitter arguments and infighting?
Well, I think that we definitely, it's urgent to wait. Urgent to wait how it will work, what will be the agenda of Assemblée Nationale, how extreme left will manage with all these seats and these successful elections. If they will remember today who makes them king, who did them king, who makes them king yesterday by withdrawing their candidature, because it's also a case, those people have been elected with their opponent, no, with their supporter only. So, and I think that the president is carrying a hell of a responsibility for this very, very unreadable situation.
It's interesting you say that. The leftist bloc, known as the New Popular Front, is a broad alliance of left-leaning parties. Now, they campaigned without a figurehead. It's widely believed that that's because they wouldn't have been able to agree on a leader. So if they do become the largest bloc in the next government, how do they choose a leader to become prime minister, and who do you think that might be?
I have no idea, but the president is going to choose a prime minister. And so it's very, very important to wait and see how the party will be organized in Assemblée Nationale. because the tradition, not the law, the tradition is that the president is picking the prime minister into the majority of the biggest group of Assemblée Nationale. And right now, we don't know how it will be. Maybe socialist, maybe the centrist and the moderate will make a coalition and will become the most important group, and the prime minister will be picked among them. So I think that we have to wait, maybe expecting another surprise from the president. I don't know. I hope nothing more right now, because we need to swallow this situation and understand how it will work. We in the Senate, we are very quiet, and there is no dissolution of the Senate. We are carrying the stability of the institution. But then that is another point that we have to see how the institution of the Fifth Republic will bear with this situation.
From what I understand, in France, that relationship between the president and prime minister is an interesting one. And the last time there was any kind of real, perhaps friction or dynamic that was different was back with Jacques Chirac and Lionel Jospin. And I wonder, if there is a prime minister of opposing parties, how it might affect French policy at home and internationally on subjects such as Gaza or Ukraine.
Well, first of all, you have to know that international foreign policy is definitely in the hand of the President of the Republic. I mean, that is a private area for him. But at the same time, for the budget, for declaration, for some law, the situation can have an impact. Especially extreme left is very much in favor of the situation in supporting Gaza and the Hamas. Which create another commotion in the Jewish population here. People who explain that October 7 was a resistance and not terrorism are now sitting in the National Assembly. We have to deal with that.
It's interesting, you know, when you've mentioned a couple of times how National Rally were kind of, their voters were denied some kind of real representation. I wonder, what were the factors, though, that persuaded almost 1 in 3 French voters to support the policies of the party on the right of the political spectrum?
For different reasons. First of all, a lot of people, such a lot of mistrust against the traditional party. And they say, well, National Rally, we didn't try. We never tried. Let them have a chance to lead the country, and then we will see. So it's something new. Then they have these issues and their lyric about immigration, about security, about France and French first. And I think that those subjects has not been solved by other party and other government before. And so the people, they are absolutely fed up with the situation of security in France and migration, for example. So it works.
Actually, you know, Marine Le Pen and her 28-year-old protege, Jordan Bardella, who had looked set to become France's youngest ever prime minister, they say it's not a defeat for their party that they massively increased their share of the vote and representation in Parliament, the National Assembly. But they said the result is merely a postponement of them ultimately taking power in France. Do you believe that to be a fair analysis?
I think so. I think so, because the people who are not able to read properly the situation will think that the current government is cheating on them and on their will to see the National Rally leading the country. And so next time they will vote more. And in the meantime, the National Rally candidate, they will have time to prepare themselves for the next time, because believe me or not, next parliamentary election will take place in 1 year and something, maybe 14 months.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, Senator. I was going to ask, what danger is there that opponents of the far right might now feel overconfident, thinking they've defeated their opponents once and for all, and that the struggle is now over?
No, they will prepare themselves. You know, we had a lot of people dropped in some area where they have no bases, no roots, nothing, and they still make 40% of the ballots coming from nowhere. Coming from nowhere. We had in our constituency in Normandy a lady coming from Russia, living in the suburb of Paris, and she got 35% of the ballots. She's absolutely unknown. She doesn't know the place. She just came with a parachute to us, and she still make 35% of the ballot. So I think that for next time, they will have time to prepare their candidate carefully. And that will be another story.
So just to emphasize on that, Senator, how do you expect this to affect France's relationship in the European Union?
I don't think it will affect. I don't think it will affect. It will be like a lot of noise and furor that we know, in the British literature. But I don't think it will affect at all. They have not the power to change dramatically the regulations. They will not have any majority for that. They cannot change the constitution because the Senate will be opposed to that. They will not be able to put any of their electoral promise because there's no money for that, but because that will jeopardize the financial market, that will scare the investor and foreign investment in France. And then they will have to face the reality of that there's no majority to vote anything. So the system is blocked right now. It's a lost year for the parliamentary work, I think.
So we've got some interesting months ahead, I think, Senator. Well, among many things, France is known for the elegance of its language. So I wonder, is there a French phrase which best sums up the view you might have on the events of the last few weeks?
Lost in translation. I don't want to blame, it's difficult to blame my president because we have to be respectful with him. But at the same time, he need to explain us what he tried to do and if he has an idea behind the head. But right now we are all lost in translation between, believe me, it's a hard time for us, very hard time.
Senator Nathalie Goulet, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
As the French public waits to see what consequences their new government's complicated political alliance brings, Britain witnessed a landslide victory for the centre-left Labour Party after 14 years in opposition. But look beneath the extraordinary success, and it's possible to find parallels to the political patterns seen in the French and European elections. Labour's massive majority was achieved with barely any increase in the vote for the party, leading to some calling it a loveless landslide and a sandcastle majority, suggesting one that could be easily swept away at a future election. The foundations for the 172-seat majority can be found in a familiar European scenario: the collapse of the centre-right Conservative Party in the face of a challenge from the populist right-wing party Reform UK. Reform won more than 14% of the vote, but as in France, the electoral system failed to translate voter support into seats. They were awarded with a mere 5 of the 650 seats, less than 1%, leaving millions of voters underrepresented and fueling calls to reform Britain's first-past-the-post electoral system. Well, now the campaigning's over, the new government has to make good on the promises it made to the electorate, something that could prove fiscally challenging considering the economic environment it faces. The incoming Health Secretary branded the country's cherished National Health Service as broken and vowed to fix it. However, irrespective of whomever is in power, Britain may have deeper problems due to the historic nature of the country's political system, the location of the government at the Palace of Westminster in London, and the traditional class structures that may determine who's who in the hierarchy. The new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, bears the honorific title Sir Keir, but his knighthood belies his working-class roots and education. Still, his so-called Oxbridge education continues a long tradition common to almost every British Prime Minister who attend either of Britain's elite universities, Oxford or Cambridge. These issues are the subject of a book by British-French journalist Alan Drake, who sees a system that is desperately in need of repair if there's to be any real democracy in the United Kingdom. In Fixing Broken Britain, a blueprint for national revival, Drake explores the potential disasters of the current situation, from a lack of real representation for the working classes to the risk of the Houses of Parliament's antiquated sewage system actually exploding. I travelled to London to sit down with Alan Drake and seek some insight into what he believes is wrong with Britain and how it might be fixed. Alan, thanks for making the time.
Pleasure to be here.
We'll go into details on what you've written in the book, but let's start with the title, quite provocative, Fixing Broken Britain. Is it that bad?
Well, if you look at the news every day, I don't think you can draw any other conclusion, really. And it's a phrase that's become more and more used in the media. If you look at the number of people using food banks, the amount of pollution in the rivers, the situation in the National Health Service, where people have to wait an extraordinary length of time to get medical attention, I don't think there's any other way to look at it as broken Britain.
I'm curious as to what made you want to write this book. I mean, full disclosure, you and I were journalists, 40 years ago in the BBC, and I've seen you go through that journalist path and then end up in the Council of Europe. But what made you think about focusing on Britain?
Well, when you live abroad from a country that you grew up in, I think you have a better perspective of it because you have something to compare it with. In my case, I could compare it with France, and I live 2 kilometers from the border with Germany, so I'm often in Germany. So in effect, I have 2 countries to compare the UK with. And when it comes to particularly transport and health, there's no comparison between the 2 countries. For example, Strasbourg has 5 or 6 tram lines, whereas the city where I grew up, Cardiff, is not even one. And I guess it was a sense of frustration that grew over the years that Britain was not progressing as it should for quite a wealthy economy in the world. And I guess Brexit was the last straw because this affected my life directly by making me a non-EU citizen and having to apply for French nationality, for example, which is quite a big deal. So I guess it was a sense of frustration and also a desire to explain to people, in particular, even in my own family, my children who never grew up in the UK, how this country functions and what its weak points are and how to put it right.
So I should say, ironically, we've got the Palace of Westminster behind us as a backdrop. And on page 2 of your book, you write, inspiring architecture does not necessarily make for inspired political decision-making. As a venue for a modern parliament, the Palace of Westminster would never win any prizes. It's a huge tourist attraction and it looks beautiful, so what's wrong with it?
Well, I think as a functioning place of work for politicians is not very functional. That is to say, it has many safety aspects, fire risks, asbestos risks, even sewage risks. There's a risk apparently of the ancient sewage ejection system exploding, which would be quite nasty. Also the way that it's not functional for disabled people, so the handicapped and cannot access it correctly. But most of all, I think, is the design of this place, which is originally a palace, of course, so it's not a democratic venue in a sense by definition, but also this the design of the House of Commons, which is like 2 opposing benches of people looking at each other, often shouting at each other, instead of the normal European design, which is a circle where people are more inclined to compromise, to be more moderate and collaborate and cooperate with each other.
And those 2 seats are 2 swords apart?
That's exactly right. This goes back to ancient traditions where it grew up in a form of a church, which is why it's like the form that it takes. And as you say, there are 2 swords, distances between the 2 sides to keep them from physically attacking each other. But there are other traditions like snuff boxes, which are provided for people to take, and so on and so forth. It's really rooted in tradition, but there's no, for example, another problem with it, there's fewer seats than there are MPs. So, for example, there are 400 and something seats, but 650 MPs. So there are not enough seats for people to sit in. And that means that you can't have electronic voting, which is another thing that most parliaments have.
And essentially by being a 2-seat system facing each other, there's no room for multi-party politics?
Well, the whole design of the House of Commons at Westminster is confrontation and winner takes all. So it's not about collaboration and cooperation. It's about one party lording it over the other parties.
Britain's also unique in having a House of Commons and a House of Lords. And you write a whole chapter on the House of Lords where you say, the House of Lords is a massive insult to democracy and a monstrous carbuncle on the face of British public life.
Yeah, well, that quote was an amalgam of two other quotes, which one was from the Prince of Wales, now the King Charles, and the other one was a reference to the death of Dylan Thomas, who inflicted a massive insult to his brain by drinking too many whiskies at a bar in New York. So why do I say that? Because there are so many things that are anti-democratic about the House of Lords. First of all, it's unelected, and many of the people just get appointed because they're party donors or perhaps friends or associates of the Prime Minister of the day. Then you have the fact that people at the House of Lords, there are 800 or so of them, and they don't have to do any work, but they can claim £300 a day for just turning up. And it's quite paradoxical that in the UK there's a lot of emphasis on benefit fraud, that's to say poor people falsely claiming unemployment benefit or other benefits, but you can go to the House of Lords, you can claim for £300 to do absolutely nothing and nobody bats an eyelid. That's normal behaviour. Well, I don't think it is normal behaviour, and that's why I say that we should replace the House of Lords with something more democratic.
Why has this system, which you describe as so redundant and perhaps corrupt in a kind of financial way, why has no one challenged it before?
I think the British are peculiarly attached, and especially the ruling class in Britain, to tradition and privilege and class. And I think that because things have been this way for so long, there's a reluctance to challenge them because of a fear, if you like, about what might happen if we change one part of the system. It's like that game with a pile of bricks, and if you remove one brick, you might bring the whole thing crashing down. I also think it has something to do with the fact that the UK has never been invaded for so long, and therefore it's never had to change through domination of a foreign power. And there's never really been a revolution in the UK in the French sense of the revolution. So the ruling class has been able, and the ruling traditions have been able to carry on without being challenged.
One of the things that Britain has is, as we said, perhaps a slightly antiquated system with the House of Commons, the House of Lords. We've got this kind of monarchy as well in the mix. Other countries have developed their own systems. And you did a chapter on constitution. And in that, you talk about modern democracies. You say, in a modern democracy, every citizen should have a basic understanding of the Constitution. The one thing that everyone can agree on is that the UK's current constitutional arrangements are opaque at the best of times, and we're not living in the best of times, you say. So what's wrong with the lack of understanding? Where is it that we're missing some understanding of it?
Well, as you say, most countries in the world have a written constitution or a codified constitution, one that brings everything together in one place. The problem with the British system is that it's an uncodified system, constitution. There are lots of pieces of paper around, but there are also lots of conventions. And these are things which depend on people's goodwill and good behaviour. And we've seen over the last 10 years that conventions are not always observed, and that's one of the problems with the UK, is that there are no hard and fast rules. You can make things up as you go along. For example, with the Brexit vote, this was a very important constitutional change for the UK, and in a normal democracy, if you change the constitution, you need a 2/3 majority, which would be 66%. In the Brexit vote, it was sufficient just to have a simple one-vote majority over the other side, which is like 52% to 48%. It's hardly majority at all, and so it divided the country in a kind of very brutal way. And there were no other rules concerning the referendum either. For example, in Switzerland, if you want to have a successful referendum, you have to have a majority of the cantons to vote. for the proposition. So in a UK context, that would have mean that, say, England, Scotland and Wales would have had to have voted for, and it wouldn't have mattered if Northern Ireland voted against, because it would have been a 3-1 victory. But it was a 2-2 score draw in the case of the referendum on Brexit, which in another kind of democracy would have meant that the proposition to leave the European Union would have failed. So in other words, not having a clear constitution can lead to some quite major disruptions in the country because you simply haven't written things down in a clear way, like an instruction manual.
So let's look at Brexit specifically. You said obviously it affected your life in quite a negative way. What other things have happened that tell you that there was a big mistake?
Well, I think if you look at the simple economic statistics, that there's no evidence of any benefits economically to Brexit. Of course, it was sold as an opportunity to do a lot of trade with the rest of the world, but these opportunities don't seem to have been taken up, and at the same time it's become much more difficult to trade with Europe due to red tape and higher cost of doing business, basically. So I think the main thing fallout from Brexit has been a hit to the economy, which of course has also hit public services because there's less tax revenues and so on to pay for things like the National Health Service, transport and all the rest of it.
So talking to the French and German people you get to meet regularly, how has their opinion of Britain changed because of Brexit?
I think most French and German people still feel a great deal of affection for the UK because it has a great cultural capital, things like the pop music and comedy on television and so on and so on. But I do think people are mystified by what they see as an irrational decision, one that's clearly contrary to the national interest, and some people have described as an act of national self-harm. So I think that maybe they feel sorry for us. They don't say that to me outright, but I would say that on the whole people are kind of bemused.
And it doesn't really help that when you watch British government at work, it seems kind of a bit of a spectacle too. You write about parliamentary behaviour, which seems to become, well, because of televising, has become much more visible to people. It says in your book, if global Britain wants to truly earn the world's respect, it needs to get its house, the House of Commons, in order. It's high time to banish buffoonery, shun celebrity, and prorogue politainment.
Yeah, politainment was a word I made up for I don't think it's only me that made it up, but it's this mixture of entertainment and politics that seems to drive British news coverage of politics, that it seems that we have a very short attention span, that we want our politics to be like a pantomime in some ways, with people shouting at each other, very much based on people's personalities and character, what they look like, how they eat a sandwich in the case of a former Labour leader, and all kinds of irrelevant details. I mean, I think if you look at Germany and France, they do things in a much more serious way without this need for politicians to go on game shows, to go and become entertainers, either by showing their dancing prowess or their prowess in the jungle or whatever it is on British TV. French politicians and German politicians don't really feel the need to prove themselves in that way.
Do you think that kind of behaviour, though, adversely affect sound decision-making when it comes to politics?
I think there's a distinction between the show business side of it, which is the House of Commons, especially Prime Minister's Question Time, and the decision making, which is of course informed by experts in the civil service and other sources of expertise. So I don't think it impacts too much on the quality of decision making. I think that's more about our electoral system and the way that it's not representative, which is something we can maybe talk about in a moment.
On proportional representation, you say, proportional representation fits perfectly with traditional British values like fairness and non-discrimination. A country that believes in equality when it comes to ethnicity, religion, gender and sexual orientation should also believe in equality when it comes to casting a vote. What's really amiss there?
Well, I think the problem is that the British political system in its voting pattern, in its voting system, does not reflect the strength of opinion in the country. So, for example, in the book, I refer to the 2015 general election when UKIP, that's the UK Independence Party that wanted Brexit, they got 3.8 million votes, which is 15% of the electorate. And for that, they got one one seat in Parliament for 3.8 million votes. Similar distortions happened with the Green Party and to a certain extent with the Liberal Party. That is to say, you have some parties that are overrepresented, which tend to be the main parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And then you have people who don't get any representation in Parliament at all. And this is not how democracy should work. Democracy, if you have a Parliament, it should represent all shades of opinion, even ones that we don't agree with ourselves. For example, I'm passionately anti-Brexit, but I do believe that the Brexit Party, the UKIP party, was incredibly hard done by. And if you had had those voices in Parliament, maybe you wouldn't have had the need for a referendum. You could simply have had a vote. So for me, it's about justice, really. And as I say, as you quoted, if we've gone to such an extent in this country to stop discrimination against people of different colour, sexual orientation and different religions, why should we still be discriminating against, for example, Green Party voters, Liberal Democrat voters, voters for the Brexit Party? Why should not they have the right to have their representation in Parliament along with everyone else?
So what it boils down to is a serious imbalance in the way different voices are being heard in the country.
That's right. And one of the things that would happen under a proportional system would be it would almost certainly force cooperation between different parties to form coalitions. And at the moment, British political discourse tends to be very raucous, and there seems to be no willingness to admit that the other side has a point or that the other side could possibly be right about anything. But in coalition, you have to strike compromises. And I think this is mature democracy. And I think this is what the UK needs to become. More boring, perhaps, but more effective as a democracy, because you'll take better decisions in the interest of the vast majority of the people if you have coalitions that represent the majority of the people.
There's often an expression used by critics of maybe perhaps traditional profiles of politicians and people in charge, and it's the pale male stale. Which seems, some would say, is the case, the way you're describing it, through the class structure in the UK. But we see members of parliament from different backgrounds, different ethnicities. So Britain seems, at a glance, to have a fairly fair representation of its diverse, ethnically diverse population. But it sounds like it's not the case, according to your book.
Well, I think we've made a lot of progress on ethnic diversity and sexual diversity. But when it comes to social mobility, that's a different kettle of fish, as we say. I think if you look at the social background of our leaders in politics, they tend to have been privately educated at expensive schools. They tend to have gone to Oxbridge or a number of elite universities in London. And they tend to have very similar social backgrounds. You don't have to have a monopoly of leadership from one particular social class, that you can actually take talented people from the working class and give them power and trust them with that power.
I should point out, you're a double first from Oxford yourself.
Well, yeah, my social journey has been from a modest background in Cardiff, the capital of Wales, to Oxford, where I studied politics, philosophy and economics, which is a bit of a cliche because that's what all of the prime ministers tend to study. And then I went to the BBC, where we met. And the BBC is another bastion of the British establishment, very middle class and dominated by a lot of people from private schools. So yeah, my journey has really showed me both sides of the tracks, if you like. I know what it's like to come from a modest or poor family, and I also know what it's like to be part of the establishment. And so that's why, in a way, I felt obliged to write this book. Another reason was to kind of give a perspective that perhaps people who come from more privileged backgrounds are not able to give.
One thing I've noticed as I dip in and out of the UK with travelling is local authorities seem not to do the job they used to do when I was young. You know, the streets were kept well, everything. It seems they struggle to keep up financially, and you write about it. When you write about local government, you say, to quote you, a decade of austerity from 2010 to 2020 saw local authorities lose 77% of their income. How can they keep going?
It's a good question. Many, many more of them are declaring bankruptcy with each week that passes. And
so these are local government organizations basically saying we're broke.
That's right. And as I say in the book, austerity, cutting back of central government funding for local authorities has had a lot to do with it. And this is not the situation in France or Germany or other places where there's far more autonomy for local authorities to raise taxes locally and not to depend on central government, because Britain is one of the most centralized countries in Europe, incredibly. I think only Bulgaria is more centralized. It's a sad situation, but one which is retrievable if you gave more tax-raising powers to local authorities.
So where is the money going? I mean, Britain's population has continued to grow, and logically one would extrapolate that this means more return in taxes, more funds, more demand on the system, but it's 77% is a massive number in terms of financial decline. Well,
I think there was a lot of austerity in that decade that applied not only to local government, to the National Health Service and other things. So Britain really, as a country, didn't save a lot of money in the past for this kind of situation. When we had North Sea oil, we didn't set up a sovereign wealth fund like Norway did. They're a very wealthy country today because they kept that money from oil extraction. When we sold off thousands of council houses and we privatized many utilities, it seems we didn't put that into a sort of savings account either. So I think one of the reasons why Britain is feeling the chill at the moment is because in the past we didn't really prepare for a rainy day. Or I think, like a politician once said, we didn't fix the roof when the sun was shining.
It's interesting because when we look at it, Britain, I mean, certainly growing up, felt like it had a huge sense of self-importance. The British Empire still talked about. The sun never set on the British Empire was the phrase. So it seems to have been a massive drop over what, a couple of hundred years? It must be. So let's look at what you say about the need for education on the British Empire. A YouGov poll carried out in 2014 found that 59% of those questioned thought that the British Empire was something to be proud of. Only 19% claimed to be ashamed of its misdeeds, and more than 30% claimed they would like it if Britain still had an empire. So there's a large group of Brits who seem to think that this was a magnificent time, but there were the flaws, weren't there?
I think there were many flaws, and I don't think British people realise the kind of things that we got up to. And that's one of the reasons why they have this rose-tinted view of the British Empire. Of course, when they see ceremonies with people wearing lovely costumes and things like this, it makes you nostalgic for a past. But I don't think if you knew the real details of the past, the way that we exploited some of the countries, for example, India, the amount of resources that were taken out of India, including consequences for the population in terms of starvation, that food resources were removed. In Bengal, there was a huge famine, and I think 3 million Indians died because of that. I don't think British people realise either that at one point we were selling opium to China. So at the moment in Britain, it's still illegal to consume cannabis, but there we were, a kind of narco state, supplying at the point of a gun, forcing the Chinese to buy our opium, which was grown in India largely. There were other things like the torture that was gone on to suppress the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. The taking over of Diego Garcia, which was an island near Mauritius, which the Chagossians were expelled from to make way for a US base, and they've never been allowed back there. So many of these kind of inglorious episodes of the British Empire are kind of airbrushed out in favour of a positive narrative about what we did in World War II, where we helped to liberate Europe from the Nazis. And I think this, in some cases, is sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card to kind of expiate the sins of empire.
So if Britain had, to this degree, kind of pillaged the resources of the world to that degree, where has all that money gone?
Well, I think if you travel around Britain and you see the amount of stately homes that there are, and other ways in which it was probably ended up in private pockets, which is why it's not that much evidenced, as you say, in public things. But a lot of people became very rich, of course, and built very nice estates for themselves in the country, and townhouses in big cities. So I think the answer is that it probably ended up in people's pockets individually.
Another factor, as someone who went through the state education system, as did you, was your writing about the private education sector in Britain. And you talk about it, you say the independent sector, as you refer to it, accounts for a staggering 74% of senior judges, 71% of officers in the armed services, 55% of top civil servants in Whitehall, and 50% of cabinet ministers and members of the House of Lords. So between half and almost 3/4 of elite jobs and elite people are essentially those who went through private education, correct?
Correct, yeah.
So what does that do for true representation of the working class that don't have that benefit?
Well, I think it means it makes it much more difficult for working class children to attain those kind of positions in society. And I think the negative side of that is not only a question of equity, of fairness, of meritocracy, but it's also a question of what kind of decisions can you make for a whole country if you have an elite which is drawn from a small part of that country. So if they don't understand how working class people think and live, and what they do and what their priorities are, how are these elite people who have been separated from working class people all of their lives, how are they going to take decisions which are in the national interest? Because most people in the country are, of course, working class.
And even within the elite, there's the elite. So, for example, Eton and Harrow as private schools, public schools as they call them here in Britain, Oxford and Cambridge is a quite very narrow band. And you write, actually, Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, was the 20th old Etonian, he went to Eton, to enter Downing Street, closely following in the footsteps of his distant cousin David Cameron. For more than 200 years, there have been only 4 elected Prime Ministers in Britain, British Prime Ministers, who are not privately educated. So that's an even bigger removal from the average person, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's, again, not a very good recipe for sensible decision making if you have your Prime Minister class drawn from such a narrow band of British society. This cannot be healthy. We need, as a country, to draw people from a much wider sector of society if we're going to take decisions which are to the benefit of the vast majority of people. So I don't think you'll notice any difference in the quality of leadership between those 4 Prime Ministers who went to non-private schools and the ones who went to Eton. I think that we've done experiments to show that the private education is not the be-all and end-all when it comes to leadership. So my feeling is that we need to expand our social reach, really, and have leaders who understand more about the general population if we want to take good decisions for the future.
So what is the fix, Alan? Because so far we've got terrible Parliament building, a terrible parliament. Maybe Guy Fawkes missed his chance. Got a whole bunch of issues with elites running the country, removed from understanding the average person. We've got so many broken systems in the sense of even the way the Constitution or the equivalent of a constitution, written constitution, should be. It's a lot to fix. So when you say in your book, you call it a blueprint for national revival, can these things be fixed?
Well, they can be fixed. And one of the questions I address in the last chapter of the book is whether we want to fix them, whether Britain actually really is prepared to go through that process. But I recommend a lot of different things. And of course, you can't do everything at once. Just like when you're renovating a house, you can't really, if you want to continue living there, you can't do everything at once. You have to do one step at a time. So I would say there are 2 steps which are the ones to take for the first 2 steps. And one is a symbolic one, which is to move to a different Parliament building, because if you move to a modern purpose-built Parliament building, this would symbolize a country that wants to change. So symbolically and functionally, because it would make for a much more efficient parliament and a much more efficient decision making, that is a symbolic step to take.
Sorry, would you also take it out of London, which has been the hub of everything?
I would prefer it to go to Birmingham or to Manchester, and to have it completely removed and nearer to the bigger population centres outside of London, and turn the old place into a museum of democracy to make money, like Madame Tussauds or another London tourist attraction. And the second thing is proportional representation, very cheap to do, that would transform the political landscape into a representative, democratic one.
That's fine. We change the building, we do certain things like that, but we still have the elite running the show, according to you.
Well, I think if you had a different political composition of the House of Commons, that would encourage people to go into politics who are not from the elite, because they'd realise that they would have a good chance of getting elected. And in the medium to long term, that would change the elite. The elite would no longer have that monopoly on power. And hopefully that would lead to a more diverse, in the social sense of the word, leadership.
Is it a catch-22, though, that those people in power, because of their privilege, don't want to give that up, and therefore we'll never see change?
Well, it's a good question. Obviously, it's not in the interest of anyone who has made it to the top to destroy the system that has put them there. On the other hand, there are moves afoot. For example, in the Labour Party, there is a majority now of party members who want to have proportional representation, even though that might be to the detriment of the Labour Party forming a majority government in the longer run. So effectively, you're right that it would take some act of generosity by one of the two ruling parties to actually sacrifice their party interest for the national interest and bring in a representative voting system.
So let's quote with your conclusion: we have to choose between transforming ourselves into a modern democracy or retain our debilitating system of tradition, class and privilege. Are we going to sink, giggling, into the sea, or rise from our sick bed? What do you think?
I'm not a betting man, but I know that Britain is a very conservative country with a small c. And if you had to push me on this one, I would say that I'm not holding my breath for major change in the UK. I think it will come one day, but perhaps not in my lifetime, perhaps in my children's lifetime, because I think it's like Churchill said about democracy, it's the worst form of politics apart from all the others. And I think that there's another phrase about a blind squirrel eventually finding a nut. And I would say that this is the scenario that Britain is in. I think it will falter around until it does find the right way, but it probably will, because it'll be forced to find the right way if it's to avoid decline.
Ironic, because there are so many nuts in Parliament, you'd think the squirrel will be well fed.
You said that, and I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, one thing, that slightly pessimistic view does mean that there's more likely to be a sequel to your book, because Fixed Britain doesn't seem to have the same appeal. Alan Drake, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Finally, if you're unexcited by elections, lack a passion for polls, or revolted by voting, the good news for people in the UK is that the campaign was relatively brief. It took just 6 weeks from the moment Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced the election while standing in a rainstorm outside 10 Downing Street without an umbrella, or sans parapluie, as they might say in France. French President Emmanuel Macron's snap election was even more merciful in its brevity, a mere 4 traumatic weeks from beginning to end. And Iran elected a new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, within 7 weeks of the sudden death of his predecessor in a helicopter crash. All of this contrasts hugely with the political purgatory of a US presidential election campaign. The winning candidate will take office in January 2025, 12 months after the first primaries take place. So, if you're dismayed by democracy, I'm afraid you're in the middle of a whole year of pain. That's it for now from me, Riz Khan, and the team. We'll see you next time.